I'm Mariana Hirsch, and with Jean Howard and Laila Abulugod, I've been organizing this year's set of events on reframing gender violence. Please come up, all three of you, here, because we have a little time for discussion, and thank you so much. I really want to start by just expressing my awe of the work that we've been hearing about, and my admiration for our three speakers, not just for the amazing work that they're doing out there in the world, bringing stories to us and images to us that we really wouldn't otherwise see or know about, but for the tenderness and the protectiveness and the care with which they treat their, and I don't even want to say their subjects, but with which you treat your collaborators in creating these stories and images, and the respect you show them, and the ways that you get beyond the victim stories to show us full lives, and to show them to us and to bring them to us as desiring subjects, as humans who want to have a life and whose lives have been interrupted by major geopolitical events, and also by structures and systems that produce violence all around us, and in particular also gender violence. So, and also for taking the topic of our session so seriously, to try to see both how gender matters and how it structures things, and also how it can, posing the question of gender, Sarah, you particularly showed how it can obfuscate or conceal certain things, and that, you know, the point of highlighting stories of women can also conceal other ways of other important stories that are some of the stories of boys or the stories of families, and how we really actually have to enlarge the frame. So, you know, I know people in the audience will have questions. I just want to come back to one thing, Bikram, that you said in the beginning, and I know I can imagine how easy it is to get discouraged with all of the work that you're doing. And the question you asked about, does it matter? You know, what can change? How can we make things better? We can keep telling these stories, we can keep producing these images, but ultimately we just want things to change, we just want things to get better. So I was wondering if each of you could share one story where you feel that your intervention has really made a difference, briefly. I think we need that. And then we'll throw it open to the audience.
Marion.
I'm happy to chime in. I don't know if this really, I wouldn't put the credit on me in this case, but some women who did step forward to help me with the first ever New Yorker piece I did, which actually was a gender and migration story, which was about workers on U.S. military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan who, have people heard of third country nationals? They were the 70,000 people that we shipped in, that the U.S. government shipped in to do basically all of the crappy jobs on U.S. military bases, from cooking and cleaning, latrines to you know, driving goods across the most dangerous roads in the world to get them to U.S. service members. And I'd gone over, I knew I wanted to cover the wars, and I felt like I was completely unqualified to do it, and I didn't know what's my place in this conversation. And I landed there in Baghdad and saw immediately a Burger King, a Pizza Hut, and a Cinnabon, and a beauty salon, all staffed by Fijians, Nepalese people, Ugandans, and I went into the beauty salon and pretended that I really needed a manicure in order to justify my journalistic inquiry, and found that these were women who had come from Fiji thinking they were going to get a great job in a beauty salon in Dubai, which they'd been promised, a really high-paying job for which they had to turn over their passports and a huge sum of money. And so it turned out they were essentially trafficking victims, taxpayer-funded ones at that. And so the first piece I actually ever did for The New Yorker was not the informant piece, I'm realizing, because I think I may have said that. That came second. The first piece I did was actually about this massive workforce and these women who were really, really brave to come forward, because the challenge is, as you kind of get at in your piece, you always fear that maybe you're throwing certain individuals under the bus to make the larger systemic points, and these women really stuck their neck out, and they did actually ultimately get fired, it appears, and by the time they'd gotten back to Fiji, they were willing to have their whole story on the record, and legislation was passed around it. So it was an example of people who actually were at great risk to themselves, wanting to speak out on behalf of others.
Well, when I was working on my first book, Illegal, I told you about the two women and that their cases were closed with UNHCR. That was the case when I was working with them. I spent 3 years living with them, pretty much. I mean, I lived in my own apartment, but I spent a lot of time with them. And one of them, Suad, she was from Somalia, and her case was closed. Okay, there is a refugee status determination interview that the incoming refugees have with UNHCR. And if the UNHCR protection officers are not convinced by their stories, they close their cases. And once cases are closed, then that person is dropped out of refugee status, and she turns to an asylum seeker, a migrant, whatever, by definition. So she cannot really have the legal privileges that a refugee could in Turkey. And Suad's case was one of those. So was Zimbabwe's. In Zimbabwe, we really couldn't help her because there were a lot of variants in her case, and the fact that she had several other countries in which she could have sought asylum, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these technical difficulties, but with Suad, we had a better chance. However, it's just like any other legal case. To open up a case, you need new information. And nobody had the time. I mean, there are so many. We're flooded with refugees and migrants that are coming into Turkey, and the aid agencies they are so small in number that they do not really have the time to investigate every case. But I had the privilege to spend a lot of time with these women. So every time we were going over her story over and over and over again for the book, because I was trying to get it right. And in her own words, just say why she left Somalia and how she did the trip that she did, and what we could give that was new to UNHCR so that they could reopen her case, and we found it. She kept on talking about swimming across, that the ship had dumped them in the middle of the water, and then she had to swim across into the southern coast. And she kept on talking about this river filled with alligators in Beledweyne, where she was from in Somalia. And that tiny little bit of information I managed to confirm when I was in Darfur, talking to a French guy whose wife was Somali, who was from Beledweyne, and he said, oh my God, that river is so infested with crocodiles that what she's saying is actually true, that's where she must have, I mean, it's impossible for her to have learned how to swim, but she probably learned it in a public, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this whole story about how Suad learned to swim and how she actually managed to swim from the boat onto the coast. So we brought a bit of information. I brought it back with me to Istanbul. We submitted it to her file in UNHCR. Her case was reopened. She was interviewed one more time, and this time I provided all the different versions of interviews I had with Suad and how they changed, where they changed. It's really hard talking with refugees and migrants about their stories of flight because they want to conceal certain things and they want to exaggerate certain things, thinking that it's going to make them more eligible for a status. But when they start exaggerating, that means they are lying about it, then their credibility falls through and their cases are closed. So it's really a thin line, and they don't really know about that. So all these series of interviews that we submitted to the UNHCR had Suad's case open, and she got resettled in Canada after that. But we couldn't help with Zimbabwe. So.
So Kate Muther, who's here with us, she and I worked together at the York Prison for Women a couple of years ago. And this is sort of a story of a chain in a way. We worked with there were 10 women who participated in a project that was built around Judy Chicago's piece that's installed in the Brooklyn Museum. And they each designed a plate that honored a woman that they had known or admired or whatever. And we worked less on the actual production of the plates, but more on the storytelling around that. And through that exercise, we came to know the women. One of the women, a woman named Lisette, had just been released from jail. And when we met her, she told us rather a dramatic story about what her transition out from being in jail for. I think she was incarcerated 7 years, something like 7 years, for a crime which was related to driving and injuring and then ultimately killing someone. Terribly difficult story for her to tell, even though she had paid her time. She was emotionally distraught, telling us what it was like to be both in and the process of getting out and then coming back to her own community, a Latino community. The reason I say it's a chain is because of the two of you and invitation to me to join the working group, I met the woman who is running the post-incarceration center, and Lisette, who is quite talented in artistically, joined that program, was at Columbia for a year, and we thought she was on a trail to truly the blooming of a new life. And I would also say that she's on the cusp of, because she's an undocumented worker from long ago, because she was in jail, even though she paid her time, she's now on the hot list to be deported. So, you know, I think the reason I'm telling a story that isn't just, it's not over, it's never over. There are bumps in all these roads, and, you know, how far can you take? And I think, you know, the sacrifice, as you referenced, the sacrifice of one for the betterment of others, legally or, you know, policy-wise. You never rest easy, I think, when you touch other lives that are in transition of various kinds. And you can always question, have you done enough? What's enough? And it's never enough.
I'm sure there are lots of questions that you all have, so I'm going to open it up to the audience. Questions, comments, thoughts? Jean?
I have a question about a topic that's come up Thank you. I have a question about a topic that's come up by several of you, been brought up by several of you, and that's about this ethics of your profession as you're working in these very difficult spaces. And Bikram, you started by talking about how the line gets blurred between being a professional photographer and being an aid worker or being a friend. And could you speak about this? And is this a line that you worry about crossing? Is this a line that should be crossed? Should it be crossed in certain circumstances? What do we mean by this? You know, could you comment on that?
I'd love to hear you talk more about that, because I was so intrigued by how you described that challenge.
Well, okay. I did my master's in broadcast journalism at Boston University, and there we were, you know, it was constantly we were hit in the head that, you know, you're a journalist, you should be objective, and you should have a, you know, distance between you and your subject so that you can look at the whole picture. Oh, sorry. But it's not really like that in the field, because especially when your subject matter are human beings, people just like you know, we're not, I mean, I have a hard time labeling them, you know, calling them refugees and migrants. And recently I started using a word, you know, victims of forced migration, because, I mean, this is something, again, going back to what Helen keeps on saying, where do you draw the line? You know, when is that line drawn from the person becoming a migrant and then crossing over to becoming a refugee? Just like what I was saying with Swat in Zimbabwe. But anyway, when you're working in close proximity with your subjects and you're spending a lot of your time with them, I think the only thing that I ended up sticking with in terms of ethics is there is no matter how dire a situation they're in, there is no exchange of money between me and my subjects. So I don't pay them to get their photographs or their stories or whatever. I do, however, try to help them, you know, get them in touch with certain NGOs so that they can find means to sustain themselves if that's the case. But it's just out of the whole, you know, ethical relationship between you and your subject, the only thing that I managed to hold on to is that one. So I don't pay for interviews, I don't pay for photographs, but everything else, like if I can help them, because you're spending such a long time with them, and it's just after a while you start, you know, it's just, I find it hard to live otherwise. So that's how it is.
Do you think it's a line in the sand?
This is a
You're
really
teaching at the
tough
J
one, Right, I
school.
mean, there's really no correct answer, which maybe speaks to my belief in my gratitude that I do not live in an era where we have that same old school construct of objectivity governing journalistic ethics. I think we're shifting maybe towards a norm that is more about transparency, about where you're coming from. So that to me is part of how I walk that line, is trying to let readers know, both kind of epistemologically, how do I know what I claim to know? And then also make clear, ideally, that I'm a human first and a reporter second when circumstances demand it, such that, in the story I just described to you of the Fijian women who were victims of essentially trafficking or indentured servitude in Iraq, one of the things I faced was when I went to knock on one of their little, it's called a containerized housing unit, their CHU, where they were living, I found that one of them was crying and revealed to me that she had been sexually assaulted. And it was one of those ethical moments as a journalist where the imperative I felt to ensure that people were not being sexually assaulted with impunity on the base was strong. And so, but the way I tried to reconcile that was I wound up calling the emergency sexual assault hotline that was posted all across the base. I was really impressed, actually. It seemed like the military was taking this seriously. They'd posted this everywhere. I called the emergency hotline, and I found that no one answered. And the phone rings and rings and rings, and then 3 days in a row I call this emergency hotline and no one ever picks up. And that ended up being really important journalistic data. So I think by responding in a human way, you also acquire journalistically valuable information. But I also do think it's one's duty to ensure that you do make clear to your sources, especially in the context of trauma, that you are there as a journalist and not as a therapist or as a friend, because I think that that's one of the reasons I was touting the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma earlier, is that the best practices in the realm of trauma reporting are so complex, and I suppose there are no right answers, but one thing that has always felt important to me is to maintain some degree of clarity with the source, because I think that can become messy and then extractive.
Yeah, maybe it's maybe helpful if we're not trained in boxes. That's sort of, I mean, the box of journalism and what that means. And I love the word transparency, but at the same time, I think it's so difficult to anticipate fully all of what might occur as a result of any kind of reporting, photographic, textual, broadcast. It is really so not to give them the illusion that we are as empowered as they may want us to be at times, that to understand, to what extent the representation that we do might impact them in ways that we can't foresee. And as much as you might say, it's so unknowable. And so the honesty of that, I think, is, terribly important. So often we've been in places where people say, tell our story, and we might, and it might not do what they hope it will do. It so rarely does. So, it doesn't mean you shouldn't tell the story. It does mean you have to be challenged to find new ways to tell stories, which is, I think, what we're all talking about, new ways to activate or create different paths to another level of empathy or engagement, people wanting to do something because they see, they read, they feel the responsibility. It's not just on us. We're part of the conduit, the chain.
Yeah, I was struck by the different media and also venues that you each found, or ways you found to tell the stories, and places that you found to tell the stories. So, Sarah, you talked about, I'm so lucky because it's the New Yorker and they support long-form journalism, and Bikem, you said, it's not new, gender-based violence is not news, it's just how do you make it news? Media, journalism and the media normalize stories, and they just want to wrap things up and they want a nice ending, and so you've managed ways to find ways out of these constraints, and I'm wondering whether this, to complicate the boxes. We called it media and the arts, but it strikes me that you're all journalists, but you're also artists, your beautiful writing and the beautiful images, and then also Susan, I think the project that you described to us is really an art project, and it would be difficult to do just as a journalistic project to get the women as involved as they are and to figure out ways to tell stories without showing faces. I don't know, you could do it as a book, you could do it by showing it to us, or online, but I don't know what journalistic media, frameworks might be
Oh,
open to that kind of.
I actually
storytelling. So
am
I'm just
sure
wondering
that
about,
it'll have that kind of life.
the borders
Yeah.
that you all have to cross in order to be able to do this in the way you want to do it.
I think it's crossing borders, exactly what you're saying. And I think things can have multiple platforms, and I don't know to what extent the two of you do that, other than online and print, and Sarah, if you do that, but I mean, for me, it's never been just a single platform, so it might have a print publication life that could be in a magazine, or it could be a book, or it could be in an exhibition. I mean, one of the photographs right now from this series is at the Photography Gallery in London, and it's simply a single image framed, and it's asking people to respond to, it's one of the emergency rooms. So it invites readers and viewers to engage with the material in a very different way than you would expect if it was in a publication. Sarah and I are yet to work together. We just promise each other, and it's going to take us another decade.
No, I got
She's
a lot of
gotten
ideas
closer,
from
though.
this.
The last time we had the conversation was in Washington, at least a year and a half, if not 2 years
In
ago.
the last
And she's
20
now in
minutes,
New
I'm
York.
getting all kinds
So
of
think
thoughts.
what happens if we're unleashed on the world, Bruce, You know what I mean? You got it? You're going to have to give her, how soon do you get a sabbatical?
No, I'm thinking about this crossing borders thing, though, and hearing you talk. I love how you actually approached these, first of all, the idea of pictures as dialogical, as invitations to a conversation, what you just described of putting that picture up and asking for responses, and the way that you used images of artifacts to evoke the people who we couldn't otherwise see. I really like that, partly because my training is mostly in anthropology and the tools of ethnography, and so that's one of the things I think about when I think about crossing borders is how do we bring in the tools of kind of an anthropological mindset, whether that is like a focus on artifacts or on kinship structures in people's family networks, but seeing your images made me think about a more active repertorial move one could use to actually ask people to create artifacts that exemplify something. So I loved that. Anyways, enough of our love fest. Any other questions?
Time for one last question. Yes, please, Bruce.
Maybe to actually extend, Jean, your ethics question. As you have contracts with your protagonists, which we were just talking about, but you also have a contract with readers and viewers, web downloaders. So think about narrative ethics for a minute. All of you are working on the terrain of the most difficult experiences that these women go through that are filled with horrific detail and both large and small. How do you think about the challenge of engaging, how to use that information, how much of it to use, whether visual or verbal, how specific to get about injury and humiliation, all of that in a way that will both compel but not repel, and that is true enough without being too true. How do you think about that?
Well, I can go on with what I do for the Refugee Project. I have two sets of stories that are written. The extensive, the full story, which I don't use it most of the time because in it there are certain names and family members and associations which shouldn't be disclosed. And then there is the story, the smaller part, which is for the readers. But it's it's really hard. Just like what Susan was saying in her room of their own. I'm sorry. Is trying to protect the subject by not showing their faces, which is a challenge for a photographer because you want to show some human form. It's the same way, same mentality. It's just to get enough out there to tell the story. And for me, I'm not really after the shocking stories. I mean, a lot of the anecdotes that I quoted here, they are very, very graphic, etc. But the bulk of the Refugee Project is very, it's a flat line. Because it's how life is, we don't always have these really extremely shocking stories. Maybe it's just a straight, crossing the border story, but it's still important because there is a great argument which I always refer to. Susan has had in 2007 Harper's Magazine on her defense of the rights of her image, and she talks about context. It's as long as we can define, we can provide the context for our photographs. For me, that's enough for the reader. And if they want to find out more, they can do that on their own. You may say, what happens with the rest of the story? The longer form. Depending on, I have a lot of personal relationships with people that work for NGOs. I sometimes provide them with that. For example, in Swat's case, I provided that story for UNHCR so that they could reopen the case. But that's a totally legal, use. So.
I'm curious because my guess is that Sarah and I are both working in different ways, building a long story, and my use of a long form of a book, which are both linear forms, even though book can be more open and interactive in a certain way. Most people don't start in the middle of the New Yorker story. Hopefully they get to the end. Books have the problem, truthfully, that most people flip from the back and you've started very carefully from the front, and that's the most annoying thing to watch in any bookstore. But in this particular project, very carefully, as you see that, as you see the full structure, it goes from this absence to presence, and that's something that's very progressive and subtle, even at the level of how many possessions people have and their desire to possess more. And the other thing, thinking about this, knowing that people, if they knew that this was going to be a book about DV, domestic violence, how do you open the page and not feel overwhelmed right to the begin with? So how much, it's almost like, and that's where I think we probably have a similarity of how much in the beginning, however you lay out the context. I mean, my kind of context is say, there is this place. You can't know where it is. There is this place. And then there are these places within the rooms. But when I'm actually dealing with the testimonial part, it's quite progressive that you slowly, hopefully, want to know more about how it is that they got there. It's not the focus initially. And so I'm not asking them what they don't want to offer. And the longer I build relationships, which relates to how long they stay, literally, the longer they stay, the longer I have opportunities to know them and they share more. So you actually feel that if it works, the narrative then grows such that when you get to the diary, which is probably 2/3 and the end, you're really inside Talak's little world. And it's the deepest, darkest story, and it's the most surprising. And up to that point. So when you build a linear process of a long form essay, whatever amount of words they give you in pages, how do you process that too? Do you feel you need to bring people in within the first 2 paragraphs to make sure they keep turning the pages?
Yeah, and then it's also all about what you withhold. I think so much of just the basics of storytelling are about withholding as much as they are about revealing. And so I think that's one way around thinking about the question of, or the temptation of sensationalism when telling these stories. But I've also had to learn to not be patronizing in my desires to be protective. Because I would imagine many of the people in this room err on the side of you want to be hypersensitive to the realities of telling trauma stories. And I think at the beginning of my career, that led me almost too far in the wrong direction of being so protective that I would almost silence women when they were telling me their stories. And I came to learn, actually, again, through the story of the Fijian women, I got to watch lawyers who were going to potentially bring a lawsuit on their behalf question these women. And I saw that questions I had been really nervous to ask, the lawyers asked every single one of them and did the entire chronology, and the women actually really wanted to tell that part of the story, and they felt honored and respected by the granularity of the questioning. And I learned through that experience, like actually sometimes giving people the right to decide that they want, even in that case, they wanted their names attached to the sexual assault claim. They wanted that out there, when my tendency would have been like, let's not say the name,
Right.
let's keep this private. So that's been a thing I've grappled with. And then one other additional thought, and this goes back to the objectivity question, I should have added to that I think, while I don't believe in that old school construct of objectivity, I believe very, very much in the profound need to strive for fairness, and not just fairness in the sense of accuracy, but also I do try to read every story I write through the lens of every single person who appears in it. And I know that's ludicrous because I can't imagine to be in their heads or presume that I ever could, but I've tried to think about using that to also complicate people we would deem perpetrators in the context of stories. So recently I wrote a story in the Juvenile Sex Offender Registry, and even in the context of thinking about gender-based violence and domestic violence, how do we have more complicated visions of the person who we would normally think of as like the bad guy in the story is also a question of great interest to me right now.
Well, so much to take away here. Thank you all so much. We're out of time, unfortunately, but